Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Felipe Pedraza, and I am the Ag teacher and FFA advisor here at East Jackson High School in Commerce, Georgia. And today I have been asked to make a short video on some of the ways that I teach or conduct my horticulture class during COVID, and the protocols that we have to follow, as well as a couple of virtual teaching ideas that I've kind of done through the weeks that we've been virtual. Um, so the tips and tricks that we're going to talk a little bit about today are some of the things that have worked for me, and kind of what worked for my program and for what's worked for my students. So feel free to kind of edit them to make sure they kind of meet your needs, but always thinking about what's going to work for your program and what's going to work for your students. Um, I have been, or we are very fortunate here in East Jackson to have a rather large greenhouse. It's about 100 feet long, so it gives me plenty of room to social distance my students. One of the things that my administration and the board have stressed very adamantly through our students and parents is that our students wear masks, faculty wear masks, which I'm sure is probably the case at your schools. So we've been pushing that a lot, and that's definitely something that I push in my classroom, and specifically here in the greenhouse. In the greenhouse, you have a lot of tunnel ventilation that kind of goes through, air is being pulled from the back of the greenhouse to the front, typically because it tends to be a little bit warmer in the greenhouse. And so with all that air being here, there's a lot more air circulating than there probably would be in a normal classroom. So that's definitely one of the things you have to think about whenever bringing students into the greenhouse, is to make sure they have their masks on, because if a student sneezes towards the back of the greenhouse, it's probably going to carry a little bit further down than it would in a regular classroom. So making sure the students have their mask on, make sure to enforcing it in a positive way to make sure that their students aren't getting a little aggravated, but making sure that they're following those protocols, and kind of stressing the importance, especially in the greenhouse, of how important it is to kind of wear a mask and to make sure to follow those protocols. The other thing that I do is just to make sure I space my students out. So whenever we have something to do in the greenhouse, I plan a little bit far in advance to make sure I have the workspace and the areas that each student is going to work in. One of the ways that I do that is by sitting down and looking at the order of plants, plugs that I have coming in. Once I figure out what I have coming in and the quantity, I also go ahead and sit down and start planning out the containers that each one of those plants or plugs are going to go into. Once I figure out the containers, I kind of figure out how many of each container, and then I go ahead and draw out a plan of, okay, I'm going to use 300 4-inch square pots to plant these plugs in. And so then I assign those 400 square pots to a student that they'll be responsible for filling up. Um, Now, I don't do any counting pre-hand. Students are going to be the ones that are responsible for counting their containers. So once they count them, then they're going to be responsible for filling those up. And so that's kind of one of the ways that I do it there. And that's usually the way that I did it prior to COVID, just to kind of help out and make sure each student was responsible for a specific task. One of the things that I do now, just to kind of space the students out a little bit, is we count everything out ahead of time. I have a student or so that kind of works for me, and through work-based learning, he's kind of our greenhouse manager, and he comes in here and he would count the containers that are needed for the specific plants that are coming in. Once we have the containers ready, then I bring my hort class out, and then I space them out. Half are going to be on one side of the greenhouse and the other half are going to be in the back, but still trying to space them out as much as possible. I did get my or ag mechanics class a couple years ago to build me some potting benches. So I kind of drew up the plans and had them make it. And so our potting benches are about 4.5 tall and about 10 feet long. And so they're made perfectly to be able to fit through a door frame without having to flip them over and trying to get the legs in first and pivoting and trying to get the other back in. So they're made perfectly to fit through the door. And so what I do then with my potting table, since they're about 10 feet long, I put a kid on each end, and then I put one kid in the center. And so those kids are going to be responsible for the entire period of filling up the containers. And then I have a couple of runners, which are the ones that will come up to the potting bench. They'll collect the containers that have already been filled, and they'll take them to the specific place in the greenhouse where I have a sign for those pots to go. And so then you're using about 5 or 6 kids throughout the entire process, 12 depending on how many benches. I have 2 potting benches in my greenhouse, so that's about 12 kids. And each potting bench is doing something different, filling up different containers, so that way we can make sure we get all of our containers done. But at the same time, you're socially distanced them far enough to where it's a little bit safer than being right there on top of each other. So let me show you really quickly what that looks like. So I have to flip this over. That's going to be our potting bench right there. So if you look, it's about 4 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. So I have a kid on this end and I have a kid on that end, and then I have a kid kind of on the back side back there next to the fan. And so that kind of leaves this front space of this potting bench open for kids to come up and grab. Now, if you look, I also made sure that there was a lip inserted into the potting bench, so that way when students were filling them up, or filling up containers, and they finished with them, they would just stack them up on side that lip, and that way the student would just be able to grab them. That way no hands are touching whenever they're exchanging containers. Once the student grabs the containers, they take them to their spot. And so, like I said, I previously have spots in the greenhouse and kind of assign where those containers go. And then students would just place them kind of like this right here. Always make sure, and if you tell them to put them in neat rows and stuff, it'll take them a little bit longer. So one, make sure everything's done properly, and two, they're not always coming back at the same time. And so that way you kind of space your runners out so they're not both meeting up here at the same time. But super important that you plan all of this ahead of time. It's a lot easier if that is done. Like I said, you have your list of plants that are coming in, and you have all your containers that are needing to be filled up. And so again, that'll kind of save you from sending a bunch of students to grab all these containers and then counting them. So if you have everything done, and then you just assign those students a specific job, it becomes a lot easier. And you can also go ahead and plan to socially distance those students based on what you're doing that day. Now, the easier part is whenever all the plants come in. So all of our containers are completely done, or they will be done once the plugs get here. And so then you can assign students a specific station in your greenhouse. So you can have one student here, 10 feet down, you can have another one, and each one of them are planting different pots, or different plants. And so that way you can spread them out even further. I always like to have about 20 kids in my hort class, 20 to 23. I think that's the most ideal number. I know some people rather have a little bit more just to kind of help out with that. But to me, it's always been easier to work with a smaller group and get them to actually really learn and kind of embrace the working process of horticulture. And so that tends to be a little bit easier for me than having 30 kids in here and having to assign them each something different. So definitely with 100 feet of greenhouse, you definitely have that possibility of being able to spread out those students. But again, if you take time at the beginning to go ahead and plan everything out, know how many plugs you have coming in, and know specifically what containers those plugs are going to go into, that's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of stress a little bit later on once those plugs get here. And again, socially distance those students, making sure those masks are on. Another thing that I usually do when we come into the greenhouse is I pretty much try to turn all the fans off in the greenhouse. We're only in here for about an hour and 10 minutes or so because we're on block schedule. So I tend to turn all the fans off while the students are working in here. Now, depending on the weather outside, if it's really, really hot, then I try to leave them on. Or if it's really, really cold, I leave the heater on. But for the most part, I try to turn the heaters off and all the fans, whether they're the circulating fans or the exhaust fans. That way there's not a whole lot of air circulating in here. So again, if a student were to sneeze, sometimes students will pull their mask down just a little bit and their nose is exposed. And if they sneeze, sometimes it'll carry it down, and that'll kind of help with the carrying of any particles after they sneeze. So that tends to help. However, keep in mind, one of the biggest things, if you do that, make sure you turn everything back on once you leave. Because I made the mistake of not turning stuff on one time and it got really, really hot in here. So it's super important to make sure everything comes on, but that's kind of one of the things that I do as well, just to kind of take that extra step in making sure my students are a little safe. The other thing that I do, and just kind of depending, on your admin and whatnot, I also play music in my greenhouse. I have a really big speaker in here that we kind of blast music, and not only are the students jamming, it's a little bit more happier atmosphere. But one of the things that I have found with playing music or letting students listen to music on their AirPods or whatever they use is that there tends to be a little bit less chatting and more concentration. And so, with having less talking, of course, you're kind of lowering the potential for particles to be in spread, especially, if they slip their mask down for just a little bit. Once they get in a working mood and they slip it down, they kind of forget. So playing music also will tend to lower that chatting and talking, so that the way there is not much sharing of particles, if any. So I found that to be super effective. And again, students are willing to kind of help out a little bit more, and especially if it's beat up music or music with a good beat. So kind of another tip there. Um, One of the other things I will say, if whenever you get your plants in and you have all your students working, make sure you give your students very specific directions. Um, with if you bring in several varieties of a plant, but they're all different colors, make sure that you instruct your students to only keep them here and don't grab them over here. Making sure that you properly tag your plants is going to be important. So I would definitely cover that with students prior to bringing them into the greenhouse and letting them kind of plant stuff and whatnot. So biggest thing you don't want to do is for them to mix up different or the same variety of plant but just different colors, and you don't know what color they are until they start blooming several weeks down the road, if not pretty close to your plant sale. We are fortunate enough that we bought a tag machine this year, so we've been able to print out tags pretty quickly rather than having students write them out. So we've been able to put the plant name, the variety, and if you think far enough in advance, even the price for those plants that you're going to sell. So very, pretty easy machine. If you have any questions or would like more information about that machine, especially how you can buy it and that way make your own tags, just let me know. I think our machine makes about with one roll of, I guess, cartridge, it can make about 10,000 tags before you have to switch it out, and it's fairly inexpensive for the easiness that it provides. Now, some of the things that we have done virtually, we've been very fortunate enough not to be virtual for so long this year. We've been face-to-face from the beginning of August all the way to December, and then we were face-to-face for a week in January, and then afterwards we went virtual for about 2 weeks. So we haven't had a very long period of virtual teaching. However, one of the things that I found to be very effective as well when you're teaching virtually is to give your students the option of kind of riding by the school either late in the afternoon or a weekend, a Sunday before school starts that following week, and giving them supplies to take home and kind of go through a lesson at home. So one of the things that I did prior was, I think it was last year before we went out, I gave them for the students that could come up or could drive, they came by the school on a Sunday afternoon, and I had already had my kits prepared of seedlings that we're going to grow for this year. And so gave them the kit, they took it home, and then we had a virtual online Google Meets in which we talked about seeds, we talked about planting correct depth, and kind of misting and watering. So it's very unique just because different students have different resources, and kind of figuring out how they were going to water their plants and whatnot was very interesting. But giving those students those opportunities to be able to swing by, pick up materials, if you have that possibility, and for them to take something home and work on it at home, keep that hands-on engaging type deal. And that's kind of one of my things for when you do virtual teaching in horticulture. There's plants everywhere, not just ornamental, you have trees, you have grass. So anything that you can do to make it hands-on is going to be more ideal. And that way, you kind of keep that aspect going, especially when they come back and they actually work in the greenhouse, and kind of see how everything relates with more of your ornamentals and your exotics versus what they kind of have at home type deal. So kind of like I said, keeping on that hands-on is going to be a little bit better than just kind of giving them a lot of busy work at one time. But as far as virtual goes, that's kind of one of my biggest tips, is just to give your kids hands-on projects to kind of do at home. And sometimes if they can keep them, they'll end up putting a little bit more effort into it. So And then as far as your greenhouse goes, just making sure keeping up with those students, making sure they're socially distancing, making sure their masks are on, and making sure that you do everything you can in the greenhouse to make sure no particles are kind of being expressed and kind of transferred. But again, planning is going to be your biggest friend here. It takes a lot of planning, very tedious work. But if you just sit down and go ahead and plan out exactly what you're going to have, how many containers you're going to have to use, and where you're going to put them, is going to work out a little bit easier for you, and it's going to be very stress free. So, because all we do now is just fill up containers. We wait for the plugs to get in, and every student, for the most part, will know what plugs they're responsible for, where those plugs are going to go, and then what tags they're going to need to have, and where to stick those tags once the plants gets here. So, my biggest advice again is just to have everything planned out. You have everything filled out and ready to go, it'd be a lot easier. Now, one of the things that I've gotten questions before about filling up containers. So as you can tell, we have a lot of containers in this greenhouse. We have about 200 606 trays and several 6-inch and 4-inch pots. I do not start filling up containers until about a week and a half prior to the order arriving. Just because I don't want the soil to sit there for too long, and a lot of times it can get a little contaminated based on how many students walk in, or if you bring other plants in from outside. So I'll always like to do a week and a half if it's a really large order. So depending again on your time, that's when I would fill them up. And again, because you don't want to start filling containers up when your plugs get here, because then they're just going to sit on the tables for a long period of time, and the possibility of you losing those plants as they sit on the table starts to increase day by day. So having your containers done ahead of time, not too far in advance, but just enough where you time it perfectly when you get done with your containers versus your plants coming in, is going to be ideal. And I promise you it'll be a little bit stress free. And again, easily socially distanced. Whenever you have everything laid out, you know exactly where kids are going to go, you know exactly where the plants are going to go, and it's going to be a lot easier. So hope this was a little helpful. If you have any further questions, or if there was something I said that you would like a little bit more information about, please feel free to reach me. You can reach me through email on the AgEd website. I know it has our emails there. So like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks, guys.